Hey guys, Brian from Zombie Guitar here. This is going to be another lesson on modes, and this is actually a follow-up of the last lesson that I just did about modes. And this lesson here is yet another reason why people are confused about modes a lot. So in the last lesson I talked about what are known as relative modes. In this lesson I want to talk about what are known as parallel modes. So just a quick refresher about the last lesson. Make sure to check that lesson out. I'll post a link to that below. Make sure to check that one out because this is literally just a continuation of that. But just as a quick refresher, if you look at your full fretboard diagram of the G major scale, so every note that you see here on the diagram is one of the notes of the G major scale, which again are the notes G, A, B, C, D, E, and F sharp. And then the red dot indicates the note G. So you could consider the red dot to be the tonal center of this framework of notes. So if you want to make this the A-Dorian mode or the A-Dorian framework, you just simply change the tonal center within this framework of notes from G to A. So now you're looking at the A-Dorian mode. Again, you could change it to B, and then it becomes the B Phrygian mode. C Lydian, D Mixolydian, E Aeolian, and F sharp Locrian. So all 7 of those modes are relative to one another because they share the same set of 7 notes. The difference is what note you're considering to be the tonal center within the pattern. So that's relative modes. So in this lesson we're going to talk about parallel modes. So what I did in that demo was I played each of the 7 modes back to back using parallel modes. So what I mean by parallel is they all shared the same scale root. So everything was a G type of mode. So every scale that I used had a scale root of G. So that really allows you to hear the difference between each of the modes. So this is just like a different perspective of looking at the modes. You can look at the modes in the relative perspective like we did in the last lesson, or you can look at modes in the parallel perspective like we're talking about in this lesson. The fact that there's two different perspectives, the relative and parallel perspective, that tends to also cause confusion about modes. So hopefully after watching the past lesson and then this one, hopefully all of that confusion will be cleared up. So as I pointed out in the last lesson, each mode has its own specific sound. And that sound really comes from which note within the scale that you're dictating to be the tonal center. So that was all discussed in the last lesson. So you can further subcategorize the modes into major sounding modes and then minor sounding modes. So the major sounding modes are going to be Ionian, Lydian, and Mixolydian. And then the minor sounding modes are going to be the Aeolian mode, the Dorian mode, the Phrygian mode, and the Locrian mode. So let's kind of just take a look at all of these. So I'm going to keep the G scale root the entire time, but we're just going to kind of look at all of these back to back. I'm going to start with the majors, and then I'm going to look at the minors, so you can really see how this stuff looks in parallel. So let's start out with the majors. So let's just look at the G major scale here in just one octave, starting on the 3rd fret. So here's your note G. So that's your G major scale. The major scale always has a scale formula of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Each of the numbers represents one of the 7 notes of the scale. So if you wanted to take a scale and then turn it into a Lydian scale, what you do is you sharpen the 4th degree. So if I want to take the G major scale, otherwise known as the G Ionian scale, and I want to turn it into the G Lydian scale, I would just sharpen the 4th degree by 1/2 step. So in this example, the note C becomes a C sharp, and then I can make this my G Lydian scale. So you hear how much different that sounds just by running through that scale pattern and changing that one note. It significantly alters the sound. Alright, so that's just the one note change going from the G Ionian to the G Lydian. So let's go back to G Ionian again, G major. And in order to make the G major scale into a G Mixolydian scale, you want to flatten the 7th degree. So the scale formula for a Mixolydian would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7. So again, it's just a one note difference between the Mixolydian scale and the major scale. So that is your 3 different major types of modes: Ionian, Lydian, and Mixolydian. So let's now take a look at the minor stuff. So let's start out by looking first at our G major scale again. In order to make a major scale into a minor scale, you have to flatten the 3rd, 6th, and 7th scale degrees. So the scale formula for a natural minor scale, otherwise known as the Aeolian scale, would be 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, and then you're back at 1. So this is your G minor scale or G Aeolian scale. If I wanted to turn this into Dorian, I would raise the 6th degree by 1/2 step. So the scale formula for a Dorian scale would be 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, then back at 1. Alright, so let's go back to our minor again. So now you're looking at G natural minor, G Aeolian, same thing. Now let's make this into a Phrygian scale. So in order to make it Phrygian, you take the 2nd and you lower it by 1/2 step. And the result is a scale formula of 1, flat 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, and then back at 1. So here's Phrygian. That interval right there, that 1 followed by the flat 2 is really what gives it the Phrygian its sound. All right, so let's go back to Aeolian again as our starting point, and then let's convert it into Locrian now. So Locrian takes a minor scale, and it flattens the second, and it flattens the fifth. So your scale formula for the Locrian would be 1, flat 2, flat 3, 4, flat 5, flat 6, flat 7, and then back at 1 again. So here's Locrian, G Locrian. So that is G Locrian. And all those flats and stuff like that, as I said, everything is always in reference to the major scale formula. So the major scale formula again is just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. If you want to go from major scale all the way to Locrian scale, well then you flatten the 2, you flatten the 3, you flatten the 5, you flatten the 6, you flatten the 7. The end result is the Locrian. But the reason I kind of broke them up into major types of modes and minor types of modes is because 3 of the modes are much closer to the major scale, and then the other modes are much closer to the minor scale. So it's a lot easier to see that kind of parallel relationship there. But all of the scale formulas are always derived from the major scale. So all modes come from what is known as a parent major scale. And in part 1, the previous lesson, the parent major scale for all the modes that we talked about was G major. So G major was our starting scale. We then looked at how you can derive other modes from G major by changing which note within the scale that you want to dictate to be your tonal center. But still everything linked back to the parent major scale of G major. So we did G major / G Ionian, same thing. G Ionian, A Dorian, B Phrygian, C Lydian, D Mixolydian, E Aeolian, F sharp Locrian. They all have the parent major scale of G major. So if my goal is to solo in, say, C Lydian, the band that I'm soloing along with, they're playing stuff, the bass player, the piano player, they're playing a rhythm that dictates that I should be playing C Lydian, then, rather than trying to think of a completely new scale or something like that, I could always say, okay, C Lydian shares the same patterns as something, that something is G major. So I can always just go and play my G major scale patterns, which I'm most likely probably more familiar with, and it's going to produce a C Lydian sound. And I'm going to also be, kind of focusing on the note C within the patterns that I'm using. But the rhythm section, along with, what I'm doing on the leads, all that put together is going to yield a C Lydian type of sound. So that's really how you use the parent major scale. So let me give you a quick formula about how you can always determine the parent major scale. And that simply just comes from the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 thing. So if 1 is Ionian, 2 is Dorian, 3 is Phrygian, 4 is Lydian, 5 is Mixolydian, 6 is Aeolian, and 7 is Locrian. That is always going to be the formula that you use. So let's say that I want to play in D Mixolydian. I would ask myself, okay, D Mixolydian comes from what? D is 5, so that means D is the fifth of what? And that of what is your parent major scale. So D would be the fifth of the note G. Therefore, G major would be the parent major scale of the D Mixolydian mode. So if I wanted to solo in D Mixolydian, I could use the patterns from the G major scale. So if you ever find yourself having trouble with reverse engineering things like that and coming up with the parent major scale when you're starting out with a mode and you're trying to backwards engineer things, you can always kind of apply this one simple scale pattern of the fretboard to help you out. So let me show you what I'm talking about. So remember, 1 is Ionian, 2 Dorian, 3 Phrygian, 4 Lydian, 5 Mixolydian, 6 Aeolian, 7 Locrian. So let's look at this movable scale pattern. Let's just look at our G major scale. This is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then back at 1 again. So let me show you how you would use this scale pattern to reverse engineer things in order to come up with your parent major scale. So let's do this by figuring out the parent major scale for each of the 7 modes that I used in the example in the beginning. So we had G Ionian, G Dorian, G Phrygian, G Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and Locrian. So G Ionian, that was the first example. We're already at 1, so G major is the parent major scale. It's the same thing. So let's now try to reverse engineer things for G Dorian. So if Dorian is 2, let me figure out where that scale pattern would fall such that G would land on the 2. So if I use this scale pattern here, G would be my 2 there. So if I'm starting on G Dorian and I want to reverse engineer back to the parent major scale, I know that it's F major is the parent major scale. All right, so let's now try it with G Phrygian. So I can't really move down any further, so let me try and find other G's up here. So let me just, I'll use this G right here, 15th fret. So that would be the 3rd of this. So here's my G, that's the 3rd. This comes from the parent major scale of E flat. So let me try to find my parent major scale for G Lydian. So for Lydian, I'm going to try and find a G up here on the A string. So here's a G up here on the 10th fret. So if my 4 is here, then my 1, 2, and 3 are here. 4, 5, 6, 7. So here's my G. So that's telling me that comes from the parent major scale of D. So D major would be my parent major scale for G Lydian. So let me try and find the parent major scale for G Mixolydian. So here's G. That would be the 5th of something, the 5th note of this pattern. So that's coming from C major. So G Mixolydian comes from C major. That's the parent major scale. So then we have G Aeolian. So if my G is here, and I want to make that my 6th note of something, so B flat, that's coming from the B flat scale. G Aeolian comes from the B flat major scale. And then finally I have G Locrian. So for G Locrian, I want to find where my G is on the D string. So I have a G here. So if that is my 7th note, alright, so G Locrian comes from A flat. A flat major is the parent major scale of G Locrian. So hopefully that 2-step process helps you to determine the parent major scale for any mode. So whenever you have a mode and you're trying to reverse engineer back to the original parent major scale from which it was derived from, you use that 2-step process. Apply a number to each of the 7 modes: Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, Locrian. And then you memorize where they fall into that scale pattern that I just showed you. So if you know where you're starting at and you need to know how to get back to 1, you just apply the appropriate pattern. So it's going to require you to know your notes on the low E string, the A string, and the D string if you're trying to determine the Locrian. So there's other ways to, reverse engineer back to the parent major scale, but this is just the way that I always do it. It's the easiest way. I can quickly find the answer to whatever I'm looking for very quickly just by using that pattern as a visual reference. So for the rest of this lesson, I'm just going to kind of drop Locrian. I'm only going to focus on the first 6 modes. Locrian isn't really used very often. You can try and write stuff in Locrian, but it has a very unstable sound. And there's reasons for that, which I'm not going to get into in this lesson. But let's just say we're just going to focus on the first 6 modes, 3 of which are major, 3 of which are minor. The really cool thing about modes is each of them combines perfectly with the pentatonic scale. So the pentatonic scale can be viewed from either the major perspective or the minor perspective. If you know about the pentatonic scale, you know that it's the same patterns. Again, it's just where the tonal center is located within those patterns. Well, the same thing applies to this mode stuff too, and each mode combines perfectly with a pentatonic scale. So let's first look at the 3 major scale patterns. So I'm gonna we're going to stick with G, but I'm going to kind of come up here so I have a little bit more room to work with. So here's G up here on your 15th fret. So here's your G major pentatonic scale. All right, you may be used to playing the major pentatonic scale like this as your position 1. But it doesn't matter. I just like to use this shape because this is a familiar shape that everyone knows and loves. So that's my G major pentatonic scale. So let's say I want to go and add in some notes to make this the G Ionian mode. I can do that. So here's my added notes. So G Ionian mode, otherwise known as just the G major scale, combines very nicely with the G pentatonic scale, or the G major pentatonic scale. All right, so let's go back to the G major pentatonic scale, and let's now add in some notes in order to create the G Lydian scale. So here's G major pentatonic. Here's G Lydian. So as you can see, the G major pentatonic scale, again, was just some of the notes of the G Lydian scale. So again, I can go back to G major pentatonic as my starting point, and let me now make it the G mixolydian. Alright, so as you can see, G mixolydian combines perfectly with the G major pentatonic scale too. So let me go ahead and switch things up. I'm now going to look at things from the minor perspective. So let me look at the G minor pentatonic scale. I'm just going to stay up here in this area of the fretboard just because I'm already here. So here's your G minor pentatonic scale. G minor pentatonic. Let me make the G Aeolian scale out of that, or G natural minor. So here's that. Alright, that one combines perfect. Let me start back on G minor pentatonic, and let's go and make this the G Dorian now. So that was G Dorian. Again, it combines perfectly with the minor pentatonic scale. Let's look at G Phrygian now. So starting with your G minor pentatonic, adding in some extra notes, you have G Phrygian. Alright, so you see how all of these modes combine perfectly with the pentatonic scale. So I just showed you pentatonic position number 1, but you can do the same thing. Pentatonic position number 1 can be expanded to cover the entire fretboard via the 5 pentatonic positions. So you can take any of these 5 pentatonic positions, and it would be a good exercise for you to do even. Take any of the 5 pentatonic positions and then go and see where the additional notes fall into each of the positions to create whichever one of the modes that you're looking for. So 3 major modes, Ionian, Lydian, Mixolydian, 3 minor modes, Aeolian, Dorian, and Phrygian, and then you just have to see where the notes go. So everything is kind of related, but this is the parallel perspective. So this is where things get confusing. And this is where I really encourage you to watch part 1 of this video, because part 1, in my opinion, that's the easier part to grasp. Once this parallel modes thing comes into play, then people start confusing parallel concepts with relative concepts, and then things start to get jumbled. So this may, if you're new to modes, or if you don't quite have an understanding of modes just yet, this is going to be something that you are really going to, you're really going to have to kind of watch these videos a few times If you want to watch the website version of the of either of these lessons, I have a written lesson for each of the website versions. If you're a full access member, I provide you with video backing tracks so you can practice applying this stuff over video backing tracks. I really want to make sure that you guys understand this mode stuff. If I do need to make a part 3, I'll be reading the comments and stuff like that. If I do need to make a part 3 for this series, then I'll do that, But, let's see how this goes. So, relative modes was part 1, parallel modes was part 2. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask. Thanks a lot.